Hello, welcome back to another episode of Queer History. My name is Bridget, and I like to talk about gay historical things, as the name of this series might imply. Today we are going to dive into the early days of the English invasion. Not the Beatles, but think early 1600s to late 1700s with our Daddies of Democracy era. Because of the nature of this content, I am going to be discussing some racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic people, events, and actions. This does not mean I condone these things in any way. Talking about how things were in the past does give us a better idea of how to be good people in the future, hopefully. I am a white woman, so you should maybe not be listening to me first as your primary resource on topics regarding Black and African American history and Native American and Indigenous history. It is important to talk about those, so that's what I'm going to do. But other resources will be linked down below. I also need to note that the line between non-conforming gender and non-conforming sexuality is very blurry from the historical records that we have of this time period. I might use labels like transgender to refer to people who maybe would have nowadays gone by gay or vice versa. People back then did not look at gender and sexuality the way we do now, but we can make presumptions and draw conclusions from the evidence that we have. Will it always be 100% accurate to what actually happened? Maybe not, but we can make conjectures to hopefully relate our own experiences in the world to the experiences of the people that came before us. So, let's dive in. First, we need to recognize this American formula that we kind of have pat down. And by we, I mean like people who had pasty skin like me. We were very good at othering, and we used othering as a way to justify treating other people poorly. Like, just because somebody was not a cisgendered, white, European male does not mean that they should be treated like less than human, because we're all part of the human race. But this was their idea. They wanted to take over this land to, get money and stuff. So they found reasons to make these other people seem to not be human. This othering is most well noticed, obviously, by the way Europeans treated people of color, as well as people who were on this land before they were. But because America has this very special formula that they've patented themselves, they can reuse it, and also more people, including people who did not follow the same gender and sexuality norms that they did. The same sexuality and gender norms that the Bible absolutely said they had to follow. Othering is essentially our justification to try to control other people. Controlling society is very important for whatever the ruling class is at the time, so they can maintain order as well as their higher status. Regulating gender and sexuality was just an extension of the state regulating who could and could not be part of this ruling class. They even went so far as to criminalize being a person of color or being somebody who did not fit their gender norms. The only thing you could be without vilification was rich, white, cisgendered European man who was also a Christian. And obviously most people would not check all of those boxes. Indigenous people in the early 1600s are what we would now consider to be much more progressive than the Europeans. We can especially see this through the way they perceived gender and sexuality. Indigenous people of the Americas treated men and women equally. Women could be home builders, they could be deities. Most accounts we have of these indigenous people and their sexualities and genders come from a very European perspective that obviously paints these people to be less than, so that they can therefore justify treating them cruelly. So I don't want to use a lot of the labels that they may have used, because they use them specifically to be offensive and derogatory. Europeans would describe people to maybe their own standards would be a male, but in the indigenous communities and to that indigenous person themselves may have identified as a female and vice versa. These people also often had really prominent roles in their tribes and were very well respected by their communities. But it also is important to say that they were not treated the same or perceived equally from tribe to tribe, and to generalize kind of takes away from the intricacies of the individual cultures themselves. So I don't want to kind of generalize too much, but we do have record of at least 130 tribes who to the Europeans would have people that they identified as male, but who were actually female and had female and feminine roles in society, and vice versa. And again, it wasn't like we see these people in indigenous communities and they also think poorly of them. It was maybe they see people who did not fit their gender binary, and it's not like they were thought of as degenerates. They were people who were to be honored. In the 1990s, the term two-spirit came to prominence as a general term to maybe describe these people, but I don't want to use this label to describe people who, like, my ancestors were baddies to. Like, I'm not saying that these people would take on these labels now, but it is maybe the closest term that we can have to think about these people. There was even a woman in the Crow tribe who led the men into battle as their chief and had, I believe, 4 wives as well. Very respected people in the community. Because indigenous folks had these different behaviors from Europeans, they used this as part of their justification to vilify and mistreat them. The Europeans were especially scared when it came to women or their ideas of women dressing as men because, fragile male European ego clearly makes sense, but they did not like this. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who was a Spanish conquistador, it was recorded that he had 40 Panamanian men who, or what he said were men dressing as women, ripped apart by his vicious mastiffs just for perhaps not fitting this Christian box they had made for these people to fit into. Why were these Europeans so bitter? Let's rewind a little bit to Elizabethan England. Think middle 1500s. We're going to be introduced to a new sect of Christianity called the Puritans. Yes, the chastity belt wearing, purity ring flaunting Christians you learned about in high school. Or maybe middle school. I think I learned about them in middle school. Unusually enough, back in Elizabethan England, they as in the popular culture, kind of recognized more loose variations and deviations from gender and sexuality that we'd later see in the Americas. Punishment of people who were seen to be gender nonconforming or sexually deviant were not equally distributed across the board. And enforcement of the laws and punishments of breaking these laws definitely varied greatly, depending on who was the offender. Sometimes people tolerated homosexual acts and transgender identities simply because it was just easier to not deal with them. Christopher Marlowe, who was a man who was rumored to have had sex with men and boys, allegedly said, "All they who love not tobacco and boys are fools." The Protestant Reformation was in full swing at this time, and this new group called the Puritans, along with other groups, started to question the legitimacy of the Roman Catholic Church. They referred to the Pope as the whore of Babylon and saw Italy as this place where sodomy and just deviance was brewing. They saw people like Leonardo da Vinci getting along with young men and said, "Nope, we don't want any of that. Keep it far away from us." So when the Puritans got the chance to remove themselves from this place, they were like, hell yeah, and saw it almost as like the Jews leaving Egypt. They were these people on this holy mission. William Bradford, who was the, I believe, founder or like head dude of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, called Plymouth the city upon a hill, likening to Jerusalem. When discussing the Puritans, it's important to note that it's not just a religion to be studied, but also a way they structured society to be studied. Puritanism was not just a religion, it was a way of life. These folks came to the Americas with very strict ideas of how society should be structured. Usually they got these ideals from the Bible, which had a very laid out set of terms for what a man and a woman should be and how they should act. The Europeans believed in a Christian God who made a man and a woman who had their respective duties, and the only point of sex was reproduction. So any sex that was not related to reproduction was therefore a sin. So how did the Puritans try to fix the people who obviously did not fall into their very straight, boring box? They used the law and punishment. Violence was often the punishment if you fell outside of this norm, and violence, unfortunately, is going to also be a theme that continues much throughout this. Laws played a big part in keeping society under control. And when you look at these laws, we see words like sodomy, abomination, unspeakable crimes against nature, sexual deviance, and these phrases were used and applied to a number of different activities. These words and phrases were used very strategically to demonize the people who partook in these actions. The restrictions they put on non-normative sex, aka any sex outside of marriage not for reproduction, was crucified or punished kind of as an on-needed basis. To the Puritans, keeping and establishing a status quo within the community was really important. And I don't know if this is just because I'm like such a Gen Z millennial border, but for so long, when I heard the phrase status quo, I just thought of the High School Musical song, which was bot, by the way. They used a broad array of punishments, such as the death penalty. The first case we have of a sodomy conviction, and if you don't know what sodomy is, open it in an incognito tab and find out for yourself. But the first case we have of sodomy charges come from Virginia in 1624, and they are for a man called Richard Cornish, and he allegedly sexually assaulted sailors on his ship. The punishment and shame of same-sex interactions was a tool to control the community. Oftentimes, punishments were used specifically for humiliation and embarrassment and would occur in public so that the rest of the community could see the offender as someone you did not want to be. It was a way to scare onlookers into not committing the same crimes that that person who was being punished did. Over time, sodomy laws began to be used specifically against same-sex interactions. There are numerous instances of people being put to death in the 1600s because of sodomy charges. And sodomy was specifically outlawed in Virginia in 1610. Plymouth outlawed sodomy in 1636, and more broadly, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts outlawed sodomy in 1641. New Haven's laws were actually the only ones to specifically criminalize same-sex interactions between women in 1656, and I don't know if this is like more progressive for including women or like more egregious because they specifically vilified women, so let me know what you think. Towards the end of the 1600s, sodomy punishments were changed to other things like castration, life in prison, public humiliation, and other things that maybe were not the death penalty. Pennsylvania removed its death penalty for sodomy in 1682, but restored it for, quote, Negroes in 1700, and then restored it again for everybody in 1718. But they then again removed the death penalty in 1786. New Jersey and New York followed suit in 1796, Rhode Island following in 1798, and Massachusetts following in 1793. North Carolina and South Carolina did not outlaw the death penalty in cases of sodomy until 1868 and 1869. Now, you might assume after all this that the Puritans were not really big fans of sex. But this is actually not true. Sex was sometimes a good thing. It was a tool to regulate and control and contribute to the community at large. Community was a big thing for them, and marriage and family were very much at the center of maintaining that community. But they still had to remain pure. Sometimes, in order to make sure couples were good fits for each other, they would have the couple sleep in the young woman's home in a bed together with the parents in the room next door. To ensure purity between the couple, they would often place a board in between the hopeful newlyweds, and this was called boarding. In other instances, they would sew the couple into a sack together, but specifically sewing off specific parts so they could not copulate. But as you can probably imagine, this did sometimes get frisky. And in fact, up to 50% of Puritan marriages did occur while the couple was with child. If the community found out a couple got engaged because they fell pregnant, they would be punished less severely if they got along and made the marriage work. They thought disrupting the marriage would be more detrimental to the community than allowing a child out of wedlock. They also did not punish all deviant sex laid out equally. Let's take a look at some anecdotal stories. In 1627, English servant Thomas Hall of Warrasquyaquie, Virginia, was accused of wearing women's clothing and having non-marital sex with a woman. Something interesting about this to note is that the punishment would have been harsher if this was a man having non-marital sex with a woman than it would have been if it was two women having non-marital sex, but the people were not sure if Thomas was a man or a woman or something else. The Virginia General Court examined Hall 3 separate times and came to the conclusion that Hall was both a man and a woman, who was then ordered to dress half male, half female as a form of punishment and humiliation. The earliest I can find for any mentioning of same-sex interactions between women was from 1642. Elizabeth Johnson of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was fined and whipped for unseemly practices with another maid attempting to do which man and woman do. In 1649, Sarah White Norma and Mary Vincent Hammond were charged with lewd behavior with each other on a bed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Hammond was given a formal admonition because she was younger, but Norman was convicted. Nicholas Senshin of Windsor, Connecticut, was put on trial in 1677. He had openly admitted to being attracted to and involved with men for over 30 years. He didn't get very harsh punishments because he was a very well-respected member in the community, and the allegations were coming from people of lower classes. In 1691, Deborah Bayer was fined and publicly humiliated for dressing in men's clothing. Steve Gorton was a married minister who was suspended from his position in New London, Connecticut in 1726 for unchaste behavior with his fellow men when in bed with them. The congregation did vote to reinstate him once he confessed. But this is just another example of Puritan leaders being put above the law when it meant keeping the community together. But my favorite queer colonial story is that of Thomas Morton and Marymount. Marymount was a colony that Thomas Morton had founded in 1624 in what is now modern-day Quincy, Massachusetts. The name came from a play on words of mare mount, as in bestial sodomy with a horse, and Mary Mount, as in mounting the Virgin Mary. And let's just say Morton knew exactly what he was doing with the name of this colony. Like, what a guy, honestly. I would like to spend some time with him. I bet he has a great sense of humor. His small colony got along with the nearby Algonquin tribe and promoted interracial marriage between them and the Europeans. They were considerably more tolerant than the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had chastised them. Morton knew full well what he was doing with this. He knew he was going to make the Puritans mad. In 1627, he erected an 80-foot tall maypole topped with buckhorns. This was very indicative of the sexualized god Pan in paganism, and therefore the Puritans' version of Satan. And of this event, it was said, there was likewise a merry song made, which was sung with a chorus, every man his part, which they performed in a dance hand in hand about the maypole, whilst one of the company sung and filled out the good liquor like Ganymedes and Jupiter. And this reference in Elizabethan England time is very indicative and draws back to homosexuality in Greek mythology, so keep that in mind as well. Even though Marymount and Thomas Morton posed absolutely no threat to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they felt the need to take them down. William Bradford felt challenged enough to attack them and unfortunately succeeded. Thomas Morton was sent back to England and wrote very negatively about the Puritans and specifically highlighted their genocidal behavior towards the indigenous people. Now, we set the stage for the turn of the century. Welcome to the 1700s, the 18th century, whatever you want to call it. But we have a big culture shift during this time. Population is booming. So many more people are coming to the Americas who did not have the Puritan outlook on how society had to be structured. We had the Catholics down in Maryland. We had the criminalized down in Georgia. We had the plantations in the South. Things were different and things were expanding quickly. We also have this group called the Quakers. And honey, honestly, I vibe with the Quakers, at least early on, because they were some of the only people that continuously treated the indigenous people with respect. So, what's going on in the South, you might ask? Well, the answer to that is slavery, and there's a lot of it. By 1720, just under 70% of South Carolina's population was enslaved. With the exception of the Quakers, no other sect of Christianity had a moral problem with slavery. At the beginning of the colonies, lots of white people also were indentured servants along with the enslaved people. But soon, laws began to change, reinforcing the idea that African slaves were inferior. This new idea was established that African servitude could not end and were slaved for life, whereas whites could eventually be free or buy their way out. It was also put into law that a child of any slave would also be a slave. This kind of sounds like, yeah, we know this, but it's important to point out that this wasn't actually the case from the beginning. And putting things into law is very significant. Here, yet again, we see criminalizing identity. State slave laws were put in place to shape how society interacted with slavery. These laws required slave owners to punish runaway slaves because they were a direct threat to public safety. They had to make examples out of them, humiliate them, just like how the Puritans did with sodomy. Acceptance of slavery fell under the umbrella of othering, making them outside the normal legal, social, and moral framework. So, despite the fact that they could never be free and therefore were not citizens and therefore had no rights, they were still subjected to following the law. Make it make sense. Every time the Europeans saw a way to make someone or something inferior, they took it. And we're going to see that Europeans and their dominant cultures and sexual fantasies are going to be projected onto enslaved Africans. So, we see this cross between sexual immorality and racism. Sexuality was a way to make people feel shame, and so was race, so they combined the two. This meant that white people viewed black people with a degree of hypersexuality that was beneath that of white people. Sexual outcasts became the object of sick, repressed sexual fantasies. I also have this theory that they used the narrative of black women being hypersexual as a justification for how awfully they would treat them and sexually harass them, but that's just my theory. Sexuality was pushed onto minority communities, and this allowed the privileged white class to completely separate themselves from anything sexual. Non-white people were viewed as sexually unhinged. So, Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries start coming up with all of these new crazy ideas that broadly get labeled under the term science. These new and fancy thoughts started to really influence society quite a bit, and this is a time period we call the Enlightenment. In 1684, Isaac Newton proved that gravity does in fact exist. Now, do keep in mind that folks in other parts of the world were way beyond these Europeans. Like, the Islamic world is thriving at this point. The Chinese world is thriving at this point, but we're kind of just catching up here. Anyway, this guy named Rene Descartes came along in 1637 and started thinking rationally. Thinking rationally essentially means that what we say and do should make logical sense. Humans should reach conclusions through careful, systematic thought processes. Rationalists believe that every human was born with equal rights and should be treated with dignity and respect. Well, except for Africans and Muslims and women and non-Christians and indigenous people and gay and transgender people, and you get the point. In 1632, Mr. John Locke stepped onto the scene. John Locke was an English philosopher who had some ideas that our later daddies of democracy loved. They ate Locke up. John Locke came up with the novel idea that we just come to accept now of separation of church and state. This new idea of Locke's became quite popular in the colonies and would represent a big-time turning point of how the future U.S. would function. But hold on a second. These Enlightenment ideals very much clash with the laws we have in place that are punishing things like sodomy. Enlightenment thought aligned with bodily autonomy. As long as you're not doing anything to harm other people, you should be allowed to do whatever you want. Thomas Jefferson himself actually suggested changing the sodomy punishment from the death penalty to just mutilation. How kind of him. The Revolutionary Era would prove to be a very tumultuous time for how we viewed gender and sexual identity. We're going to see a lot of conflicting ideas here, and for a little bit we have to unfortunately dive into the gender binary. But sometimes we gotta handle the gross stuff, so put your safety gloves on. With the colonies becoming very bitter with ye olde England, they had to find ways to separate themselves from the English. They needed to pursue their own cultural identity in order to unite themselves against the evil little island across the sea. So, what do we do to spruce up our cultural identity? Let's visit the gender binary. Let's try to just reinforce the ideas that we already have established in society. And Americans became very obsessed with portraying the typical ideal American man. It's like their version of a Renaissance man. Where the traditional Englishman was refined, well-kept, even you might say effeminate and polite, this new, burly American man was bold, aggressive, one with nature, and a rugged Paul Bunyan type. Think of Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Lewis and Clark. This attitude also did a lot to shape the revolution, and therefore we were very good at the revolution. So, yay, one thing America is good at, war. Thanks. They utilized the image of the patriot to reinforce this idea too. But this perfect American man couldn't be black, even though the few black people who served the Patriot Army served on average twice as long as the white guys. The American man also had to be of a certain class. They had to have enough money to flaunt the American greatness of free enterprise. Obviously, this very specific idea of the American man was quite literally unachievable for most of the diverse population that was actually there. But you know what? If you think about it, our daddies of democracy were not actually very good role models of this American man. Our heads of state sat far away in their ivory towers with their fruity little white powdered wigs, very far away from where a lot of the action was actually happening and shaping this American man. In terms of the American woman, or the ideal American woman, was this very effeminate, white damsel that needed to be saved and was sexually absolutely pure. So, whereas black women were seen as hypersexual, white women were sexually devoid of any kind of sexual urges whatsoever. They were absolutely celibate, could not be touched. And the American man had this innate sexiness to him, a sexiness that couldn't be denied, that had to be seen and appreciated by the celibate white woman. Men couldn't control their sexual desires, and part of women's roles was to try to help contain that. In the colonies, a big part of society was keeping up the social norm through your public image. And as long as you did this, whatever you did in your private life was really up to your discretion as long as you kept it private. This cultural divide between public and private life allowed people to explore their gender roles in private and a little bit more as long as they kept up their gender norms in public. And there were people who just completely said, F this, I'm going to do whatever I want, like Jemima Wilkinson. Wilkinson was a Quaker born in 1752, and after contracting various illnesses, Wilkinson said that Christ entered into their body and transformed them to be neither male nor female. They now wanted to be referred only to as the public universal friend. They were purposefully androgynous in their dress, performances, and actions. The Friend also preached a very strict interpretation of the Bible, and the Friend's followers practically saw them as another coming of the Messiah. The Friend and their followers settled into a rural area of upstate New York that is kind of considered like a commune or maybe even a cult to today's standards. So, let's talk about the Revolutionary War. In 1776, the colonists were getting quite fed up with the English for not giving us a say in anything. So, we decided to go to war to separate and settle our differences. In 1778, the Continental Army began court-martialing soldiers for sodomy. And if you don't know, court-martialing is essentially putting somebody on trial for committing a military crime. The first time somebody in the Continental Army was court-martialed for sodomy was in 1778. This was Lieutenant Frederick Gotthold Edslan. He was dismissed for attempting sodomy with another soldier and was dismissed by none other than Aaron Burr himself. Lieutenant James McMichael wrote in his diary of the day, "I this morning proceeded to the grand parade, where I was a spectator to the drumming out of Lieutenant Ensel of Colonel Malcolm's regiment. He was first drummed from right to left of the parade, thence to the left wing of the army, from that to the center, and lastly transported over the Schuylkill with orders never to be seen in camp in the future. The shocking scene was performed by all the drums and fifes in the army. The coat of the delinquent was turned wrong side out. But honey, this does not mean the Continental Army was not free of homosexuals. Nay, nay. In fact, George Washington himself hired a known homosexual to train the Continental Army at Valley Forge. Baron von Steuben was a Prussian military recommended to Washington by none other than Ben Franklin himself. They assigned him to a camp with Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, who were arguably a relationship between themselves, who we will talk about in a little bit. Von Steuben was a lively guy who threw soirees at Valley Forge. Pierre-Étienne du Ponceau recalls a particularly wild party at Valley Forge. He said, quote, his aides invited a number of young officers to dine at our quarters on condition that none should be admitted that had on a whole pair of breeches. Literally, you could not come to this party if you were wearing pants. The men dined in torn clothing and sometimes implied absolutely no clothing at all. Von Steuben became very close with William North and Benjamin Walker. They were another couple in the army within themselves. Von Steuben lived with the couple for 2 whole years, and after the war, Von Steuben moved to the United States and lived with them there too, where he actually also adopted them, which was pretty common for gay couples at the time. North wrote, quote, we love him, and he deserves it, for he loves us tenderly, end quote. Women made a name for themselves too during the war, don't you worry. Deborah Sampson was a young woman during the Revolutionary War and was also even a descendant of William Bradford. Despite her prestigious roots, her family was very poor and she worked as an indentured servant from age 10 to 18. Afterwards, when she got freed, she worked as a teacher for 2 years. In 1782, Sampson felt the need to participate and be engaged with the Patriot cause. She disguised herself as Robert Shirtliff and joined the Continental Army. She managed to go undetected as a woman for a long time, but did have some close calls. She was found out, though, when she contracted an illness and lost consciousness. She did receive an honorable discharge, though. She went on to marry and have 3 children. In 1797, Herman Mann wrote the story of her life, provided by Sampson herself, and her biography was published as The Female Review, or Memoirs of an American Young Lady. In this book, she does publish in detail some stories of sexual encounters and fantasies with women. Part of the reason she did this was to lobby to get a war pension like every other soldier had. To additionally help this cause, she gave public lectures which turned out to be very popular in New England. Paul Revere also helped himself to get her pension, and she was successful. This proved that Sampson could be both male and female at the same time, but also be neither gender. Deborah Sampson is a certified badass in my mind. Sampson's story was so popular, a novel was published called The Female Marine, which followed protagonist Lucy Brewer. The story tells of Lucy Brewer, who was seduced, impregnated, lost her child, and then was made to work at a brothel, but then escaped, and then finally enlisted in the Marines. She was a Marine on the USS Constitution for 3 years, and the novel followed her life, how she did in battle, and some of her very close sexual encounters with women. None of these encounters really followed through, and she did end up settling down to marry a man, but the novel produced 5 sequels because it was so popular. America loved the cross-dressing female warrior. The idea was so popularized that there were plays about Joan of Arc being produced and other people who kind of also followed this storyline. This just goes to show how much attention breaking the norm could garner, and also how much breaking that norm could potentially also be celebrated. Now, I would like to end off with my favorite segment called Just Friends. And these are the people who historians would perhaps say, well, you can't take this stuff too much out of context. This was just the way friends talk to each other. These folks were just friends. But they're wrong. We're just going to take a look at the evidence, okay? We're going to read some letters. We're going to look at the fun, spicy stuff, which is like my favorite part. So let's dive in. As we know, queer people have always existed, but the society that certain queer people have lived in has varied, and therefore people have had to adapt and change with society to accommodate who they were. This took the shape of homosocial relationships. Society was so gendered to the point where they would actually really encourage friendships between people of the same gender so that they had people to relate to and to get along with, to share in their gendered interests and activities. These friendships were also a really big part of society. I mean, think about how much the patriot movement has this sense of brotherhood, right? American men sticking together, and that in itself is very homo, if you ask me, but we'll look at some specific examples. Unlike the American man myth that we had looked up to and kind of made up in the American mind, these homosocial relationships actually applied to people of many different genders, races, and classes. These homosocial relationships were also very emotionally intense, especially between women. Women also drew less attention for these homosocial relationships because women were seen as, incapable of sexual tension and feelings between one another. One of the reasons these relationships were more accepted between women is because the patriarchy implied that in order for people to have sex, a penis and therefore a man must be present. So sex without that just could not be real. Sex between women could physically not occur. So they often received less scrutiny for these close relationships than men did. So the first person I want to take at is the Frenchman Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette is somebody that I, for some reason, had a historical crush on when I was younger. I think it just because he was French and young and, I made this version up in my head of him that does very much line up with the Marquis de Lafayette from Hamilton, so I like to run with it. Marquis de Lafayette and Daddy Democracy head boy himself, George Washington, had a little flirtationship, at the very least you could call it. There's no clear evidence that they were intimate physically, but there's also no evidence to imply that they weren't physically intimate. But at the very least, their letters do have a lot of erotic undertones. And sometimes Lafayette writes to Washington like a hurt lover. On June 12, 1779, during the height of the Revolution, Lafayette writes to George Washington and says, quote, "My dear General, there was never a friend, my dear General, so much, so tenderly beloved as I love and respect you. Happy in our union, in the pleasure of living near you, in the pleasing satisfaction of partaking every sentiment of your heart, every event of your life, I have taken such a habit of being inseparable from you that I cannot now accustom myself to your absence, and I am more and more afflicted at that enormous distance which keeps me so far from my dearest friend." These run-on sentences or something else. So we don't necessarily see that as directly homosexual, but he clearly is referring to George Washington as a very close friend whom he does not like being separated from. A few months later, he writes and says, quote, "My dear General, from those happy ties of friendship by which you were pleased to unite yourself with me, from the promises you so tenderly made when we parted at Fishkill, gave me such expectations from hearing often from you that complaints ought to be permitted to my affectionate heart. Not a line from you, my dear General, has yet arrived into my hands, and though several ships from America, several dispatches from Congress or the French minister are safely brought to France, my ardent hopes of getting at length a letter from General Washington have ever been unhappily disappointed. I cannot in any way discount for that bad luck, and when I remember that in those little separations where I was but some days from you, the most friendly letters, the most minute accounts of your circumstances were kindly written to me, and I am convinced you have not neglected and almost forgotten me for so long a time. I have, therefore, to complain of fortune, of some mistake or neglect in acquainting you that there was an opportunity of anything. Indeed, but what could injure the sense I have of your affection for me? Let me beseech you, my dear General, by that mutual, tender, and experienced friendship in which I have put an immense portion of my happiness, to be exact in inquiring for occasions, and never to miss those which have conveyed to me letters that I shall so much pleased to receive." very long-winded here. This letter is like, why aren't you texting me back? It's like, clearly, it's like Washington left him on read and has not replied to his text in a very long time. And Lafayette saying, I know you're getting these messages. I know that you're on social media with these other people. Why aren't you texting me? That's the vibe I get from this. Lafayette sees Washington as this person he looks up to so much. How can I separate myself and understand why you don't want to communicate with me? Very much a hurt lover. So next, we've got Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. I could potentially do a video on just the two of them if you like, but we're just going to do a brief overview for now. Lawrence was said to have made easy connections with both men and women, but kept his very emotionally deep relationships just for men. Hamilton himself also likely encountered homosexuality early on in his life because up until the age of 10, he lived in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is where lots of people and empires would send their sodomites or degenerates, so he was probably exposed to these people early in his life. Hamilton wrote to Lawrence and said, quote, I wish, my dear Lawrence, that it might be in my power, by action rather than words, to convince you that I love you. End quote. Actions proving that he loves him. I wonder what those actions could be. They spent a lot of time together early on in the Revolution, but John Lawrence eventually felt called to go fight for his homeland of South Carolina, and Hamilton and Lawrence had to separate. But there was a point in which Hamilton did actually request to be transferred down with John Lawrence, but George Washington said no. They then start corresponding through letters with each other. During this time, Hamilton gets engaged to Elizabeth Schuyler, but actually neglects to tell John Lawrence for quite some time. Many letters from this time are also missing, and it is quite likely that some of them were destroyed by family members of either Hamilton or Lawrence. In these letters, they may have even discussed the future of their own relationships. Unfortunately, these never would come to fruition because Lawrence would die during the Revolution. Next is Daniel Webster and James Hervey Bingham. And Daniel Webster is a name you might recognize if you paid attention in your history classes. He served as Secretary of State under 3 different presidents and was one of the 19th century American Great Triumvirate trio, along with Henry Clay and Calhoun. He was also in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and he and I share a birthday, Capricorn Queens. Bingham, on the other hand, was not as famous. The two went to college together at Dartmouth and were very smart boys. They wrote to each other in a manner very similar to some of the letters we've already looked at. Webster wrote to Bingham on February 11th, 1800 and said, quote, I now sit down in poor spirits to write a poor letter. To a poor fellow, shall I say? No, say rather, to the friend of my heart, the partner of my joys, griefs, and affections, the only participator of my most secret thoughts. On October 26, 1801, Webster to Bingham, quote, O Bingham, and Bingham forever, there is a kind of magic in your pen. I know not how it is, but if you write in a language perfectly unknown, you afford me more pleasure than a well-penned and intelligible letter from a common friend. Of all folks in the world, I should not last think of flattering you. But, in honesty, I knew not how closely our feelings were interwoven, had no idea how hard it would be to live apart, when the hope of living together again no longer existed. However, it may be thought rebellion against nature, and I must confess, if I were this day to embark for Europe, my regret at leaving any other person would not be greater than leaving you. Let's dissect this a little bit. There is a kind of magic in your pen, magic in the letters he's receiving from his friend. He didn't know how much their feelings were interwoven and how much the happiness in his life was dependent on his friend, Bingham. He says that if he left and started a completely new life, he would not miss anybody as much as he missed this friend. And he also talks of it being a rebellion against nature. At this time, rebellion against nature could mean things like rebellion against what they thought was normal, which was heterosexuality. When you see like all of these little things in one letter, it just makes you think like there's too much in there for it to not be gay. If you need more proof, April 3rd, 1804, Webster wrote, quote, I don't see how I can live any longer without having a friend near me. I mean a male friend. Yes, James, I must come. We will yoke together again. Your little bed is just wide enough. We will practice at the same bar and be as friendly a pair of single fellows as ever cracked a nut. We perhaps shall never be rich, no matter we can supply our own personal necessities. By the time we are 30, we shall put on the dress of old bachelors, our mourning suit, and have sown all our wild oats with a round hat and a hickory staff. We will march on till the end of life, whistling as merry robins, and I hope as innocent. This is gay. This is gay. This is gay. Like, okay, first line, I don't know if I can live without another male friend near me. Why would he need a male friend when he has women he could potentially be attracted to if he was attracted to women? Just saying. And he also says, we will yoke together again. Your little bed is just wide enough. So the scene he's setting out here, we will lie together in bed. Your bed is just wide enough for the both of us. And we will go out and act as single bachelors when we're out in public. But when we reconvene in private, we will be together as we were meant to be. This is gay. It's gay. He's like talking about how he wants to plan his life with this man. That's what this is. And remember, the public versus private life of like what these people had to balance, and the fact that that's reflected in the letter, it just lays it out so much. Like, it's gay. Lastly, we're going to touch on the stories of Charity, Bryant, and Sylvia Drake. At this time, marriage was quite honestly a full-time, dangerous job for most women. They often had back-to-back pregnancies, had to deal with fulfilling all of the men's expectations of the time, and these pregnancies back-to-back alone were very fatal for women. Sylvia was the younger of the two and had 64 nieces and nephews. One sister-in-law of hers gave birth to 18 children. Both the Drakes and the Bryants were very negatively affected by the Revolutionary War. Both of their families lost lots in financial aspects as well as members of their family. The two women were both individually very put off by the idea of marriage. Charity vowed at the age of 23 to never take a husband, and she spent lots of her free time writing poetry. Sylvia's family was left so perplexed by the fact that she could not pay any attention to the men who wanted to court her. But when the two met in 1807, there was an intoxication in the air between them. They moved in together on July 3rd, and this was where they marked the beginning of their forever union. Part of the reason they were able to get away with this was because the couple did take on the traditional gender roles of a heterosexual relationship. Charity could, you say, quote, wore the pants, whereas Sylvia performed lots of the more motherly duties. The two ran a business together, and they both maintained very high levels of independence. Although the two did keep their letters to each other and their writings very PG and tried to be non-indicative of a relationship, it was kind of like an open secret in the town. The community knew that they were together. They knew that their relationship was equal to marriage. Their families didn't really care. Lots of people in the community didn't care. It was kind of like they were still in the closet, but the door was wide open. Rachel Hope Cleves wrote a book about the two, and in it she said that we really need to not just look at cities as areas of queer development and growth, but also more rural areas. Rural areas in America are very much reliant on each other and their communities, and they're therefore more willing to accept variances in the culture of the community if it meant that they could stay reliant and stay together. They were known as Aunt Sylvia and Aunt Charity in town. On some archived pieces of scrap paper, we see Sylvia practicing writing her name, but with Charity's surname. And that is just so cute, because have we not all done the same thing? Because I know I definitely have, and did that with my crushes. They were together for 44 years until Charity's death. 17 years later, Sylvia would join Charity in the afterlife, and they were even buried together. I will leave you with a passage written by Charity's nephew, Cullen, who wrote about their 40th anniversary in the New York Evening Post. He wrote, quote, "If I were permitted to draw aside the veil of private life, I would briefly give you the singular and to me most interesting history of two maiden ladies who dwell in this valley. I would tell you how, in their youthful days, they took each other as companions for life, and how this union, no less sacred to them than the tie of marriage, has subsisted in uninterrupted harmony for 40 years, during which they have shared each other's occupations and pleasures and works of charity while in health, and watched over each other tenderly in sickness. For sickness has made long and frequent visits to their dwelling. I could tell you how they slept on the same pillow and had a common purse and adopted each other's relations, and how one of them, more enterprising and spirited in her temper than the other, might be said to represent the male head of the family, and took upon herself their transactions with the world without, until at length her health failed, and she was tendered by her gentle companion, as a fond wife attends her invalid husband. I would tell you of their dwelling, encircled with roses, which now in the days of their broken health bloom wild without their tendance, and I would speak of the friendly attentions which their neighbors, people of kind hearts and simple manners, seem to take pleasure in bestowing upon them. But I have already said more than I fear they will forgive me for, if this should ever meet their eyes, and I must leave the subject." He writes so beautifully of the relationship between these two, how the union they had was no less equal than to that of a marriage. They cared for each other in sickness and in health. They put each other's needs above their own. They shared a life. They shared bank accounts. Their union was romantic. It was passionate. It was full of love for each other. He clearly writes as if these two women were in love, and so many people would just look at this and say, no, they were just friends. But he himself writes that this is such an undermining of where their relationship really was, where it took them in life, how each other was their anchor. They even adopted traditional men and women's roles. I mean, maybe they did this because they wanted to be more accepted by society, but maybe that's just the way they were and it worked for them. And they complemented each other in such a beautiful way that established a life that just brought them so much harmony. And this is what I live for in the gay history, is the raw emotion that we can just connect to so much. And it warms my heart. And today I hope you learned that there are a lot more queer people out there. We've maybe not treated them all very well. Most of them we actually have not treated very well. But when queer people are allowed to thrive and be themselves, they will always do so. And even when they can't, they will always resist. Thank you for joining me today. If you would like to leave a comment, discuss, subscribe if you like, anything like that, I encourage you. And thanks for joining us. I will see you next time.